The unseen struggles. In a small town in the USA, there was a teacher named Mrs. Larson, known for her strict ways and high standards. Her classroom was a microcosm of the local community, a blend of different backgrounds and histories. But one thing remained constant: her preference for certain students. Mrs. Larson, though brilliant, had a deep-seated bias that she struggled to hide. In the middle of the school year, a new student, Jordan, joined her class. He was a quiet, hard-working African-American teenager, and on the surface, seemed like just another student. But something about Mrs. Larson's demeanor toward him was different from the others. She was harsh, critical, and quick to dismiss his work despite his genuine effort. Jordan, however, wasn't just any student. He had come from a family with a legacy of overcoming adversity. His father was an entrepreneur who had built a successful business from the ground up, and his mother was a prominent community leader. Jordan's family had instilled in him a sense of pride and resilience that kept him focused, even when things seemed stacked against him. As the semester progressed, Jordan's grades continued to slip in Mrs. Larson's class. No matter how hard he tried, he was always one step behind the other students, who Mrs. Larson seemed to favor. His homework was returned with harsh red marks, his projects scrutinized, and his efforts often ignored. Meanwhile, his classmates who struggled in other areas seemed to be given second chances, or even praised. One day, after receiving another failing grade on a test that Jordan was certain he'd aced, he decided to confront Mrs. Larson. He stayed after class, determined to understand why his hard work wasn't being recognized. "Mrs. Larson, why am I always getting these low marks? I've studied every night and I really try. What am I doing wrong?" Jordan asked, his voice a mixture of frustration and desperation. Mrs. Larson, without looking up from her desk, sighed. "Jordan, you need to put in more effort. It's not just about showing up. Some students have it easier, but you need to work harder to get what you want." Jordan's heart sank. It felt like an excuse, one he had heard far too many times in his life. But then, something unexpected happened. Jordan stood up straighter and said, "Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's your idea of who I am." Mrs. Larson's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with a cold smile. "I'm sure you just need more practice, Jordan. Go ahead and grab your things. Class is over." As Jordan left the classroom, he knew he needed to take action. His family had always taught him to confront adversity head-on, but this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for a grade. He was fighting for fairness, for recognition, and for the right to be seen for who he truly was. A few days later, Jordan's father, who was well connected in the community, heard about the issues his son was facing. He decided to get involved. He reached out to the school board, and soon the issue was raised to the administration. The news spread like wildfire through the school, and Mrs. Larson was called into a meeting. What followed shocked everyone, including Mrs. Larson herself. It was revealed that Jordan was the grandson of a local civil rights leader, a man who had fought tirelessly for equality in their town during the 60s. Jordan's father was a respected businessman, and his family had long been at the forefront of social justice initiatives. The administration had checked into Jordan's background after his persistent complaints and realized there had been an ongoing pattern of discriminatory treatment from Mrs. Larson towards him, and possibly other students of color. When Mrs. Larson learned who Jordan was, her expression shifted from one of indifference to something much darker: fear, shame, and guilt. The realization hit her. Her prejudice had not only affected one student, but had been a part of a larger, deeply ingrained bias she had carried for years. Jordan's family's influence and reputation ensured that the situation was handled swiftly. Mrs. Larson was given a mandatory leave of absence, while the school conducted a thorough investigation into her teaching practices. Meanwhile, Jordan's grades were reassessed, and he was given the recognition he deserved. What began as a seemingly small issue of grades and unfair treatment turned into a catalyst for larger discussions about racism in education. The incident sparked a school-wide initiative to combat racial prejudice, with teachers undergoing mandatory training on how to ensure fair treatment for all students, regardless of their background. For Jordan, the experience was a turning point. It wasn't just about fighting for fairness in one class, it was about making sure that future